Tired of bloating, fatigue and sluggish digestion? Meet your gut's new best friend, NutriHealth 365's microbiome supplement. Restore balance, boost immunity, and feel amazing from the inside out. Smart delay release capsules. Real results. Gut health just got personal.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Monday's episode of Trending, brought to you by NutriHealth 365. Well, this is the only show I'm doing this week because I'm down in London. So you got Richard for a show on Friday and got Gareth covering on Wednesday. So today, it's a couple of days early, but I suppose a preview would have to be. We're going to talk about the budget, which is coming this Wednesday. And we're going to talk about the potential things that might be in it based on what's been leaked, what's been rumoured, what's been denied, and also what that means for you, what that means for businesses and so on. Because a lot of, when you lead up to things like this, a lot of words are said that overcomplicate what is very simple to explain. And usually that's done to make people think, don't want to think about it. I can't understand that. It's gone over my head, which is a very good way of sneaking things in because people don't look into the detail of them. We spoke about so many times on this show that the devil is in the detail, as the saying goes. People will read a headline and they'll either switch off or they'll read the headline and take the headline at face value without looking into the fine print of what that really means. So everybody knows that there's going to be tax rises in 2 days' time, despite Rachel Reeves in her last budget saying this.
Well, I've committed to just have one budget a year. I'm not coming back to this in the spring.
Parliament.
No, I'm not going to make commitments to never change taxes again. That would be irresponsible. But this is a once-in-a-Parliament budget to wipe the slate clean after the mess that the Conservatives have left us.
Now, Rachel Reeves, as we say on a regular basis, wouldn't get a job as a bank clerk somehow and lied on her CV to get the job she is in, which if you did in any other position anywhere, you would probably be fired, certainly reprimanded. Instead, she's still in office. So she's lied already. She's blamed the Conservatives for leaving her a £22 billion black hole in the public finances for her tax rises in the last budget. She's now doubled that to nearly £50 billion with her own choices. Now, most people, and people will disagree, I'm sure, but I would suggest that most people wouldn't mind paying a proportion of tax that is fair and just if what they got in return was something of value. You don't mind paying rent on a property that is nice, that you live in, that's clean, that's lovely, that everything works, the hot water works, the heating works, there's not damp, the paint looks great, the carpets are clean. You wouldn't mind paying rent on a property like that. If you were asked to pay the same amount of rent or more for a property that's full of mold, has no hot water, radiators don't work, has broken windows and all of that, you'd feel quite mugged off and you'd feel quite taken for a ride. And that is what we see here. That is what we see the world over when it comes to tax. People have paid more and more over a period of time for less and less and less and less. Now, not only is them people paying more when the price of everything else has gone up, putting people under increased financial stress where literally the choice between heating and eating is a common choice for most people. There's so many children growing up in poverty. Alongside that, you're paying more for less. You're paying more and getting less safe streets, worse public services, worse healthcare, worse education, more scandals, more sleaze, more backhanders, and more money going on things that if there was a vote on it, people wouldn't vote for money to go there. Billions have gone to Ukraine, for example. No one voted for that. There was never a referendum on that money. All this money, and we'll come to a story on it, going on these green fake climate change initiatives. No one voted in favour of that. HS2 and the billions and billions going on that. No one voted in favour of that. The big increase in the defence budget. Nobody voted in favour of that. Foreign aid budgets, no one voted. Welfare, no one voted. Migrant hotels, no one voted. All of that added together is way more than the £40 billion black hole we're told is the reason taxes will be going up. So let's look into the nitty-gritty now of what those tax rises could be and what they would mean. So income tax, which is the basic, I'm going to explain this really simply. I apologize if it sounds like I'm condescending. I'm not meaning to. I'm just trying to explain this in the simplest way possible so that everyone can understand whatever your knowledge level is when it comes to economics. Income tax is obviously the basic. You don't pay income tax until £12,000 of earnings. After that, you pay 20% on anything over and above that. That's your standard rate as a working person here in this country. Once you get up to a certain amount, which I believe is 50, you pay slightly more. And then once you get over 125, you pay 45%. So essentially, if you're earning over £125,000, which I agree is a lot of money, it's not anything like the money it would have been 10 years ago, especially if you're living in London, for example. That's actually not a lot of money. When you're paying a huge rent, huge everything else, it's actually not a lot of money in comparison. It is a lot of money to most people. I'm not saying it's not. But the point I'm making is for every pound you earn over that, the government take 45 pence. The government take 45 pence. So for you to have another £500 a month in your pocket, you've got to earn double that, essentially. You've got to earn another 12 grand a year on top of that to get another £500 a month. I don't think that's fair. I don't think tax to that level is fair, because what it's doing is it's decentivizing people to work harder and harder and harder and try and achieve. It really is. Because if you're earning that kind of money, you're making sacrifices in other areas of your life, whether that be sacrificing having a family, whether that be sacrificing seeing the family that you may have. Your work to get to that level in whatever industry you're in, you have had to make a large number of sacrifices, and you have had to be pretty tunnel visioned on one thing to get to that level. Especially these days, it's a very, very difficult level to get to for people. And I don't believe that's incentivizing people to try and achieve that. Now, there was rumours a few weeks ago that income tax was going to rise by 2 pence or 2%. That's now been backtracked on because the public backlash was so big that they couldn't get away with it. Now, I'm going to say one thing, which I said a few weeks ago as well, is what tends to happen, in my opinion, is they leak things into the press to see what they think they can get away with based on the public reaction. Now, the potential to rise income tax by 2 pence in a pound was possibly true. However, it could have also been a bit of a red herring to chuck out there. They knew it would get the backlash, so then they'll offer their plan B, which isn't as bad as that, but was really plan A the whole time. But they knew they couldn't get away with that. And they knew if they announced their plan B first, without this, they'd get backlash on that as well. Whereas now, that seems the lesser of two evils. Really, really simple tactic, used all over the place, a hell of a lot, in a lot of different contexts. So at the moment, unless something changes, income tax on pay-as-you-earn employees is not expected to rise. As I said, they pushed out the idea of it, it received backlash, and so far they've backtracked on that. So we will see in time. Property tax. Now there's a few different types of property tax. There's obviously council tax surcharges that you pay on your property, which supposedly, or people are led to believe, go to your local councils and pay for things like bin collection to keep the roads and potholes and things like that in your local area safe for local services, essentially. There's also a lot of evidence to show that's not really where that money goes. So where does that money go? Stamp duty is another major property tax, which is essentially you don't pay it on your first house, but when you buy a house, you essentially pay a percentage of the value of the house to the government in the form of a tax, which is called stamp duty. So a one-off payment. Now they're talking about scrapping that to add a tax on sellers. So essentially when you sell the house, you will pay a percentage to the government in another form of tax. There's no mention on this that there'll be a tax for the buyer. Now, if you're in a chain, what I mean by that is if you're buying a house but also selling yours and the person you're buying off is selling theirs to you and they're buying another one, that's the chain, then everyone is a seller pretty much, except the person right at the bottom that will be buying their first home, of which there's not stamp duty on anyway. So as a result, it's pretty much the same concept in terms of you paying tax on the value of a house when you sell it. Exactly what that percentage is, what the thresholds may be, I don't know. That's not yet been announced. This is something that is really a rumour at this stage. The final one on property is what they're calling a mansion tax. which is a one-off tax on valuable homes worth over £2 million. Now, a lot of people would probably get on board with that because they would see that as a tax that's only going to affect incredibly wealthy people. Now, you can kind of make that case. However, with the rises in house prices over the last quarter of a century, particularly in central cities, London and Manchester, a lot of properties that wouldn't have fallen under that category not too long ago now will. So a lot of people that maybe inherited homes, for example, that like I remember being in Mallorca once with my now wife, Beth, and we were in a bar and we got chatting to another English couple, and he actually worked for the government in inheritance tax. And he was telling me about some horrific cases that he had to deal with where he had to basically oversee people losing their homes, which I think, I did sit there after a few beers and ask him how he slept at night. But anyway, and he was telling me about a story of a young man who was born in Epping. Both his parents had died when he was very young, and he was raised by his grandmother in Ealing in West London. And she lived in a property that she'd lived in for basically pretty much her whole life. Her and her husband married very young. They bought the house and they lived in that right through. And when she died, he was forced to sell the property because the value of that house, as you can imagine in London, from when she would have bought it or she would have moved in I think it was around the 30s, 40s, to the early 2010s, was absolutely extortionate, the rise. So he didn't have that money. He wasn't a wealthy person. So in order to pay the inheritance tax, they had to sell the property. Now, we see this case a lot, and this is where the big difference between liquid wealth and assets comes in. Somebody thinks you've got a £10 million house, you must be wealthy. Okay, you are on paper. You have an asset. However, that asset is not worth anything until you sell it. That asset is only worth something if you decide you don't want it anymore. If you decide to live in it or you decide to use it, it's actually costing you money, not making you money. A liquid asset is if you had £10 million in the bank, for example. That is something you can instantly access and go and take out. And also, £10 million in the bank or in investments would be making you money in the forms of interest rather than costing you. That's the difference. A devaluing asset, so you go and buy a Ferrari, let's say, that Ferrari is only worth something when you sell it. If it's sat on your driveway, it's worth nothing to you. It's depreciating. In fact, it's costing you money. That's the difference. You could have a £2 million house that you inherited from your parents, or a £2 million house because of the length of time between you buying it or your parents buying it. And today, the value of it's increased so much, but you could have nothing in the bank in a tangible asset, in a liquid asset. At which point, if you're taxed on that property to whatever amount, 1%, 2%, you might not actually have that money. You might not actually have that money, in which case, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to sell your asset. Now, to me, that is completely wrong. And I'm not sitting here defending people that are rich. I'm trying to explain the difference between wealth and assets. An asset is not worth anything until you sell it, unless that asset is making you money. Like if you own a block of flats, for example, and you're renting them all out. If you have assets in the form of investments. If you have precious metals that all are going to appreciate rather than depreciate and not going to cost you anything while they're doing that. That's the big difference. And that is something which is deliberately misunderstood. We had this whole conversation around the last budget when they introduced the inheritance tax on farmers. And people were talking about, they've got all this land worth this. It's like, yeah, but what's the land really worth? It's worth nothing unless they sell it. For me, the difference between wealth and assets, in terms of my explanation of it, is does this earn you money by you doing nothing? If you've got £10 million in the bank, in actual money, that's going to earn interest by you doing nothing. You're going to earn a percentage on that, 2%, 3%, whatever you might earn, for literally just doing nothing. If you have a 10-acre farm, that farm earns you nothing. unless you work on it, unless you mill the land, unless you milk the cattle, unless you raise chickens, whatever it is you're doing. That earns you nothing. That's the difference. You should not be taxing anyone on things like that require them to be there, because that is not wealth. That is paper wealth. That's the difference. And people seem to misunderstand that. And the government and the media deliberately mischaracterize that. You know, for example, if you own a house today and your house is worth 150 grand, on paper, you're worth 150 grand. You might have a 100 grand mortgage on that house. So you don't have that 150 grand in your bank to go and do what you want with it, do you? So if they said to you, right, we're going to tax you at 10% of the value of your house, 15 grand, please. Do you have that? Just because you have that house doesn't mean you have that. And that's the difference. Big one here. Pensions. Now, never before has the state pension been taxed in this country. Now they're talking about doing that, as well as something called sacrifice or salary sacrifice. So basically, they started to introduce a workplace pension a few years ago here in Britain, where you have an option as an employee. Your employer has to offer you a workplace pension. You can pay a percentage of your salary into that every month. The employer pays the same. That goes into a pension fund, and you don't get taxed on that income. So let's say, for example, you take home £1,000 a month and you decide to invest £50. Okay, you'll only be taxed on the 950. You won't be taxed on the 50 you have put in. Employer the same. So essentially, for me, this is a way of preempting the complete removal of the state pension. I'm fully aware now, I'm 33 years old. By the time I get to 65, 68 or 150, whatever the pension age is by the time I get there, the state pension isn't going to exist. This is a prelude for that. It's getting people to pay into their own pensions. Now, at the moment, they're talking about adding a £2,000 cap per year. And they reckon this would raise £2 billion a year. Again, you should be, essentially, this is a savings account. Because you're going to then be taxed on the pension when you take it. If you put £1,000 a year into your pension for 25 years, let's say, and when you want to take it out, there's 25 grand in there, you'll be taxed on that at whatever time you decide to take it out. So you're essentially going to be potentially taxed twice by doing this. Okay, savings and investments. This is an area that's interesting for many people. At the moment, you can save £20,000 a year tax-free in this country in what's called a cash ISA. Now, a cash ISA is essentially a savings account, usually with a decent interest rate, that you can put up to 20 grand a year in without paying any tax. They're cutting that now to £12,000, which is a big cut, nearly half. They initially talked about cutting it to just 4, and that received massive backlash. And they talked about 10, which received backlash, but it's more likely to be 12. Now, what they're talking about doing is trying to incentivize people to invest rather than save. Now, investing is obviously considerably more risky. It can be considerably more rewarding. However, you need to educate yourself very much on what investments mean, what you're investing in, and all of those things. Whereas a cash ISA, you can sit there with complete confidence and say, I don't know, let's say there's a 5% interest rate. If you're going to go and put £10,000 into that cash ISA, you know over the year that's going to earn you £500. You can sit there and do that. And you could say £500, that's my Christmas fund to get everyone Christmas presents. And you have a degree of security about that. Whereas now, with investments, you have a huge degree of risk. You could sit there and that 10 grand could become 15, but it could also become 5. And that's the difference. And also, what they are going to incentivize you to invest in is going to be government-backed initiatives. That's almost certainly what this budget will entail. Right, next one. Tax on motorists. And we're going to come to a story here to do with electric cars. So electric cars could find themselves paying a new pay-per-mile tax, which is potentially going to be charged at 3 pence. Now, this is a story here from the BBC, just to segue away from going through the budget for a second. Electric vehicle grant scheme boost worth £1.3 billion expected in the budget. The government is expected to announce an extra £1.3 billion in funding for a scheme encouraging the use of electric vehicles. The electric car grant scheme started in July as part of a move to zero emissions vehicles, and the government says it's helped so far 35,000 people to move to electric vehicles. There's also going to be money added to create more charging points and a consultation on helping people without driveways to charge their cars. Now, it's very clear that the move towards net zero, the move towards a society where we don't have diesel or petrol cars, is an ideological cult agenda. It's not one that's for the benefit of people. It's not one for the benefit of humanity. And anyone that has any research into this area will know that the national grid, the electrical power supply, is nowhere near advanced or powerful enough to handle the amount of petrol and diesel cars we have today, all being switched to electric vehicles. It doesn't even begin to come close. And that then brings you to the next point, which is it's not meant to. Because the whole concept of the people that have cars today still having cars tomorrow is absolutely not part of the agenda. They don't want people having cars. They don't want people to have the ability to move as freely as we currently can. Hence why we're seeing the 15-minute cities. Hence why we're seeing the more encouragement of public transport. Hence why we're seeing low emission zone. And it's just being more and more difficult to take your car anywhere without paying additional taxes, clean air taxes and things like that. As they have already said now, 2030, they don't want to have any diesel or petrol cars produced anymore, or ban the sale of them, I should say. They're just going to make it more and more and more difficult for people to fill those cars up. Petrol stations will disappear, of course they would. And we're going to see more and more push towards this electric vehicle agenda when they know the amount of people that have electric cars cannot be the same as the amount of people that have petrol cars. But as I said there, it's not meant to be. So at the same time, you have a very, very clear attack on people's ability to earn a living, a rise in taxes. You're then putting funding again into something which, as I said right at the top of the show, if there was a vote on this, people wouldn't vote for it. Do you really think in this country, if there was a referendum today, people would vote in the majority to put nearly £1.5 billion into electric vehicles? I don't think they would. And I think the government know that as well. And that's why they're doing things like this. Because they know they can. There's no comeback on them. They're doing so many things they said they wouldn't do in their budget, but they know we can't do anything apart from kick off, refuse to comply. And they know really, to date, enough people have never done that in a big enough majority or a big enough number to really make a point, except during the lockdowns when we absolutely did. So as I've said many a time, it's time for that again. And it really, really is. Right. Here we go. Let's carry on with this then. So tax on motorists. Fuel duty is due to rise, which they cut to 5p, which they're talking about now rising back to what it originally was, which again will make petrol more expensive, which again will attack diesel and petrol cars and make EVs look even more attractive, because no one wants an electric car, really. I've said I'll never have one, and I stand by it. I won't drive. Right. Inheritance tax, which they came at big time last time. They're talking about a lifetime cap on gifts. Now, essentially, right now, there's something called the 7-year rule, which we're going to come to as well, because they're talking about changing that. Which is that, let's say your parents want to leave you some money, and they sort out all of their finances more than 7 years before they die, and they transfer all of that wealth into your name. If they live 7 years, you don't pay an inheritance tax on that. What they're talking about doing is introducing a lifetime cap on the amount of money your parents can leave you over the course of a lifetime. What that does is that guarantees the state are going to get the large chunk of whatever it is that your parents are leaving you. What it does, I now have no idea what this lifetime cap could be. But let's say, for example, your parents decide to pay for your university rather than you having to get a student loan and get into all that debt. They decide to buy you a car. They might decide to buy you a house. They decide to help you set up your own business. They help you with your wedding day. They then want to leave you some money in their will. All of a sudden, that's going to add up to a large chunk. Well, all of those things are now currently in jeopardy. And there'll be people watching that will say, well, good, everyone should have to earn their own right. Are you telling me right now that if you were wealthy and you had children that you could help out, you wouldn't help them out? Of course, most people would. Some wouldn't. And I agree. I don't think people should be given handouts, but you would absolutely help your children if you could. You'd give them a leg up. You'd give them a chance. Because the difference in this world between money and not money at a young age, anyway, when I say young age, I'm talking university age, high school age, it's a choice. You may choose to follow your dream of becoming a musician, your dream of being a sports star or whatever. If you had a bit of a financial buffer to give yourself that opportunity to try. Whereas most people, that's not an option. Unless they're incredibly gifted at such a young age that they have a ride right through college, right through all of this into a professional club or a professional institution or a record label or whatever. Most people have to go out and get jobs. They have to go out and pay their way. They have to go out and earn a living in order to be able to survive. At which point your dreams get put on the back burner. And for so many people, those dreams never ever come to the front hob ever again, because people get bogged down into life. They might meet someone. They might have a family. They might get a job that pays the bills. And then all of a sudden they're 35 looking back going, I didn't even think about what I wanted to do. That's where having your parents give you an opportunity at a young age can really help. Obviously, they want to stop that because they want to bring an end to intergenerational wealth. Because if everybody starts level with nothing, everyone is dependent on the system. If you start with a house and with a few quid in the bank where you can make your own choices and you're less beholden to the state, you're much more difficult to control. You're much more likely to be a free thinker. You're much more likely to follow your dreams rather than just work, pay your bills and die. That mentality which they want you in. So they want an end to that. Here's a big one as well. They want to remove the residence nil rate ban. So at the moment, if you have if you leave some money to your children or to whoever, £175,000 at the moment is tax-free. If that £175,000 is the primary residence of the person when they died. So let's say, for example, I have a house worth £200,000 and I leave that to my children. They would only pay tax on the 25. They wouldn't pay tax on the 175 because I'm leaving them a house. It goes back to what I said earlier about the difference between liquid wealth and assets, because that house is not worth £175,000 until you sell it. It's not making you money. It's costing you money unless you decided to sell it. And as a child, you may not want to sell the house that you grew up in. You may not want to sell the house that your parents lived in till they died. You might want to keep hold of that. You might want to live in it yourself. You might want to give it to your children. You might want to rent it out. All of those things should be an option. You should not be forced to sell something that may have been in your family for generations. May have been the only house you ever knew. My mum, for example, has lived in the same house since 2005. I spent my whole formative teenage years of high school and all of those years in it. I remember it. She still lives in it today. The thought of having to sell that to give the government some money for them to send somewhere else, which is not going to benefit me or my family, that to me is completely disgraceful. And the final one, what that's going to do is that's going to bring so many people into inheritance tax that weren't. And the thing is, you say 175 grand sounds a lot. It's actually not. When you look at the average house price in this country now is well over 200. So it isn't actually that much in the sense of a lot of houses are going to be in that category. It's not just a case of any, I mentioned the mansion tax, 2 million or above. Okay, that's going to be a limited number of properties that are going to be affected by that. 175, that's going to include pretty much most houses these days. And they know that. Now, removing that to include everything, that's going to lead to one of the biggest transfers of wealth from the poor or the middle class to the elite we have ever seen. Because when people are forced to sell these houses to pay this inheritance tax bill, who is buying the houses? It's not going to be a young couple looking to start their lives together. It's going to be the hedge funds. It's going to be your BlackRocks. It's going to be your Lloyds Banks. It's going to be Vanguards. It's going to be hedge funds. And what's their interest in taking care of people? None. Their interest is making money. They're buying an asset. The final one on inheritance tax is going to be the 7-year rule that I mentioned. So at the moment, you have what's called a tapered rule. So you have the 7-year rule that if you leave X amount, doesn't matter how much at the moment, and you live more than 7 years, your kids will not pay any inheritance tax on that. However, that tapers at 5 and 3 years as well. So at the moment, inheritance tax is 40%, which is disgraceful. Nearly half of anything over 175. If you survive 3 years after giving money to your children, I believe it drops to 30. If you survive 5, I believe it drops to 20. So essentially, there's an incentive for you to divest money out of your name into your children's names, because as long as you live for more than 3 years, the percentage of tax they will pay will start to decrease. They're talking of getting rid of that, basically, and it's 7 years or nothing. So you could live 6 years, 363 days, and your kids will still pay 40% if you died in that period. Grave robbing is the only way to put it. Wealth tax is the final one we talk about, which will be basically nothing. There's not talks about any form of wealth tax. There's talks, additional taxes which are discussed on things like taxis, talk about adding VAT, milkshake tax they're talking about, which is talking about an end of the sugar tax for milk-based drinks. Oh, it's just bizarre. Gambling taxes are urged to rise. It's basically any tax you can think of, any way that they can take more money out of your pocket and put it in theirs to waste, they're talking about doing. Now, we're just going to touch on a final point in today's episode, because this is quite frankly hilarious. This is Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer has warned that Rachel Reeves gets more abuse because she's a woman. No, I can think of something else that ends in "n" to describe her. Demon. That's what I'd go with. This woman is responsible for, well, I say she's responsible. She's not, is she? She's being told what to do. But on the surface, she is responsible for these decisions that we have discussed here this morning, the decisions that happened in the last budget that have left so many businesses, whether they be local businesses, whether they be farmers, this left so many people worse off. She's responsible for them. You should absolutely be held to account for your decisions and the impact those decisions have on people's lives. You have chosen to be a government official. You have accepted the role of a cabinet minister. You're not going to get a pat on the back if the decisions you're making are screwing over people. You're not going to get a pat on the back and a well done if the decisions that you make are ruining people's lives. It's got nothing to do with the fact she's a woman. At least he can remember what one is now. It's because she's incompetent at best and a demonic entity trying to destroy people at worst. Probably more likely the latter. No chance are you going to use that argument to stop people calling her out and calling out your pathetic government for what it is. The fact that it's ironic that you couldn't explain what a woman was until the Supreme Court told you, and now you're using that argument as a deflection technique to stop people talking, or trying to get people to stop talking, or start feeling sorry for your Chancellor because she is one. She's a disgrace, that's what she is. And I think this budget is going to be one of the most important, certainly the most important in my lifetime, because what is announced, the impact of that, if that comes into fruition, And the backlash from that, or of that, I should say, from the public, I think there is a huge opportunity to make a big change in the way politics works in this country. Now, I don't believe ultimately politics is the answer. I certainly don't believe anyone that has a seat or any party right now in Westminster holds the key to really changing the direction of travel of our world. But what we can do is we can make waves using the political system and use that as a springboard to make the real changes that we need to see. And the real change has to start with a revolution of perception, as I've talked about. It has to start with a revolution of self-identity and stop seeing yourself as a tiny little ant that needs to be controlled by people you think are more intelligent than you are. Have you seen Rachel Reeves? Have you seen her? I wouldn't let her do my personal tax return, even if she offered. Pathetic. These people stand there with this air of authority and superiority when all they really are is power-hungry gophers acting on behalf of a force that's far more powerful than them, but still nowhere near as powerful as us. But I see this as an opportunity because for years, for generations, decades, centuries, people have been kept separated because what you care about and what affects you doesn't affect me, and therefore why should I stand up for you? That's the attitude of so many people. We saw that disappear to an extent through 2020 and 2021 because whether you were black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight, man, woman, you were affected by the same measures as everybody else. We saw those fault lines disappear. Whether you're listening to this budget, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're somewhere in between, whether you run a business, whether you're an employee, whether you're a stay-at-home parent, whether you're retired, they're coming for all of us. They're coming for all of you. So all of those lines of division that have been used, like the last budget, all the people that were very quiet on the inheritance tax added on farms, now all of a sudden, if that 175,000 cap goes and that inheritance tax rule change affects you and your 2-bedroom semi in Birmingham, now you might care a bit more. Now all of a sudden you might understand what those farmers were talking about a year ago. So there's some unity there, isn't there? Because you're both being affected in the same way. So this is a huge opportunity to really stand up, speak up, and say enough, because you cannot keep taking from people when they have nothing left to give. And people are at the stage now, they have nothing left. Our back is against the wall. And what are we going to do? Are we going to crouch and cower in the corner, or are we going to come out swinging? Because if we don't, they're just going to keep coming at us. They're just going to keep coming at us. If a bully comes at you and you don't stand up and fight back, they're just going to keep coming. And that's what we've seen for generation after generation, particularly in the last decade in this country. And it's time we stand up and say enough. And all these things I've talked about this morning, obviously it's focused on the UK because it's the budget here, but you can apply this to anywhere in the world. The same things are happening. Your money is being squandered on things you wouldn't support, and if there was a vote, people would not vote for it. And more is being taken from you, so you have less and less decisions you can make. And more is made for you because you're backed into the corner. No one's getting better. No one's getting richer. No one's got more money in their pocket than they had 2-3 years ago. Things aren't getting cheaper. Nobody's lives are improving. So, fault lines down. Divisional lines down. Stand together, and we might actually achieve something. There's 650 MPs in Westminster. There's literally over 60 million people in this country. Enough is enough. If we don't stand up and fight for our kids now, and fight for the next generation, and fight for our generation, then there's no point. We might as well just give up. This is a key, a massive key, The 26th of November, 2025, in my opinion, will go down as a key date in history where people said, you know what, you are taking the piss to the highest order now, and we've had enough. And it doesn't take much in terms of resistance for that to snowball and snowball and snowball. It really doesn't. Thanks for tuning in with me this morning. I apologise for swearing there at the end, but this is a subject that I'm really passionate about because I know how many people are struggling across the country, and I'm sick of seeing this government literally take money, take food out of the hands of children to send it to their mates, to push it onto their ideological agenda like the fake climate change narrative or war in Ukraine or whatever. I'm sick of it. I see firsthand the city that I've lived in for well over a decade, the amount of people on the street, the amount of people struggling that weren't 10 years ago. And that's not by accident, it's by design. And if we keep going as we are, that's not going to get better. So let's try. Let's stand together and let's say enough. I'll see you next week. Enjoy the rest of your week. As I said, Gaz will be with you Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Rich will be with you on Friday morning. I'll see you next week. Have a great week, folks.